So my second choice is Color of Law. For those of you who have stopped in the store, even in COVID right now, you realize that a lot of our display space has been taken over by books about social justice topics, books about racism, books about things that are going on in America. And one of the things that I've been looking for is a book that can really reach out and speak to people on a single issue that affects everyone, that's not an issue that we realize affects us. And this is also a very personal book for me. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and in the early 70s when I was a child, if you were African American and lived in Cleveland, Ohio, it was pretty much a given you lived on the east side of the Cuyahoga River. And as a child, I never thought about this. The neighborhood that I personally lived in was a mixture of Black families, white families, because my parents chose it that way. But I realized that that was unusual, even as a child, that most neighborhoods that people I went to church with or people that I knew from school were either all of the families in the neighborhood were Black or all of the families in the neighborhood were white. And as a child, I never questioned why this was. I never really said, hey, how come other neighborhoods aren't like the one that we live in? By the time I was in high school, we were one of two white families on our street. I got to kind of, as a child, watch white flight happen as people moved out of our neighborhood. And again, I never really questioned, well, why when the Manions moved off the street, did a Black family move into their house rather than a white family? Well, The Color of Law is a history of the process known as redlining. So redlining is when, as a government-sponsored policy, banks would be encouraged to make loans on certain areas only to white families, and certain families only to, or certain areas only to families that were considered not white. And it's an entire history of this process. So one of the interesting things for me was that has not always been just African American families. There were times when Jewish families or Italian families or Polish families or Irish immigrant families, whatever that group of immigrants were also redlined. And so when you look at many places that have a Chinatown or a Little Italy, that is not just a function of people liking necessarily to be near people who had immigrated at the same time. And a lot of times it was deliberate government policy. And Richard Rothstein, who is a professor, goes over, here's the legal history of this, here's the informal history of this, and then he talks about the effects that it has in our society today. And one of the examples that he gives, it talks about if you were a soldier, fought in World War II, and came back after the war, there were government programs to help you reintegrate to society. We've all heard of the GI Bill, where people could go to college. Well, there were also low interest loans where you could buy a home, and there were famous towns like Levittown in New Jersey, which was largely settled in the late 40s, early 50s by military veterans. But what we don't think about now is it's largely settled by white military veterans. If you were a Black soldier who had fought in World War II, Levittown wasn't available to you. You couldn't get a loan for a house there. As a matter of fact, in many places, it was illegal for a real estate agent to show you a house in a non-redlined area. And so that level of segregation that happened then plays down through the generations as we see the various values of houses change. And again, this is a personal thing for me. I know, because my dad is talking about it, that when he bought the house that I grew up in East Cleveland in 1964, it was a $6,000 house, which was about a year's salary for an engineer at that time, which is what my father did. When my father sold that house in 1990, it was a $9,000 house. And in 1990, a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house in a neighborhood that hadn't been historically redlined, even in Cleveland, was not going for $9,000. So there's a huge difference in the wealth growth of families in those houses. And I just found it a fascinating way to look at it. It's not full of legal jargon, so you're not going to get bogged down and wish you had a law degree if you're reading it. But it really points out just one of the things that has affected how our entire country and our entire society has dealt with race on an official, legal way. That I think many people are unaware of, and it was really eye-opening for me. It explained a lot of things about the community that I grew up in. And I think it helps understand why we have some of the disparities that we see even today.